Christmas comes but once a year, and Rupert Lowe tried to bring it early on Sunday when he dropped the following 12-minute video directly addressing Nigel Farage and proposing that reform and restore set their differences aside and work together for the good of the country. And I'm all behind this. Just to declare my interests here, I'm not loyal to one or the other particular party, but I do have friends in leadership positions in both parties. They're good men, they're principally concerned about the fate of the country, and they've reached an impasse where Restore has kind of acted like a reform nudge unit, forcing reform to take positions of stronger conviction on things like immigration, demographics, and repealing certain laws. And Reform are kind of grateful because they've forced them to go to territory that they wanted to occupy anyway, but they were too worried that there were too many political mines to be swept before they could go there. And so the only thing getting in the way of cooperation is the personal enmity between Rupert Lowe and Nigel Farage, and the subsidiary being Zia Yusuf, because of course, in March 2025, Zia Yusuf, Lee Anderson, and Nigel Farage reported Rupert Lowe to the police on seemingly fabricated threats of violence, as well as a litany of other offences including bullying in Rupert Lowe's parliamentary and constituency office, and all of this has resulted in his expulsion from the party and the regrettable scenario we find ourselves in, which is that Rupert Lowe is leading Restore Britain, coming out with excellent policies with some really talented guys like Harrison Pitt, Charlie Downs, Lewis Brackpool, Josh Firm, but Reform is still leading in the polls. Though, their poll lead has been interrupted, they have stagnated, slipped from above 30% to now the mid-20s, with Labour and the Conservatives nipping at their heels. And so actually Reform needs their rightward flank back. They are grateful for the policies and rhetoric generated by Restore that they just have lifted straight from the pages of the mass deportations paper. And so there shouldn't really be anything getting in the way of the two working together other than personality conflicts. And this was the substance of Rupert Lowe's proposal. He didn't say, I immediately want a top job. He didn't say, these are the terms of a merger or a coalition government or a standing down in certain constituencies. No, he left the actual terms of the agreement up to Reform. What he proposed and said were 5 core principles. And if they could agree on that, they could start working together. And the cleverness of this proposal were that these were 5 principles that Reform supporters already think Reform has signed up to, support, Restore supporters support, most of Reform's leadership support, bar some of the Conservative defectors and some of the second stringers, whose reaction to this was not positive, but we'll get onto that in a moment, and that Restore's leadership unanimously support. Those 5 principles were as follows. Firstly, reversing mass immigration. Not just mass deportations of illegal immigrants, which Nigel Farage previously said was a political impossibility, which, if you remember, he did cite as the reason why Rupert Lowe was expelled from the party earlier this year, and which now Reform has committed to. Rupert Lowe said, unlike Farage's previous statements, it needs to be clear that it's not just violent criminal males that are going to be leaving the country, but every single illegal immigrant, including women and children. Because the children grow up to be those violent criminal males, and the women actually raise those violent criminal males, so if you leave them in the country, we're just going to have the same problem in 5 years' time. The second was restoring Britain's demographic security, a term pioneered by my friend Carl Benjamin, and he's delighted that Rupert Lowe has taken him up on the term, and it was also the subject of a contentious debate between Charlie Downs and Julie Hartley-Brewer on Talk, which I'll cover in a separate video. But what Rupert Lowe pointed out was that the white British population of this country, despite voting against mass immigration for the last 50 years or so, is set to become a minority in their own country by 2063. This is Matt Goodwin's projection, who is in Reform and very against Restore. One of Reform's house outlets, which is the Pimlico Journal, which has been publishing some really good articles recently, published a piece by Charlie Cole, which pointed out that based on birth rate trends between 2006 and 2026, at the rate of precipitous decline as a share of births every year, the white British population has gone from 66% to 53% by 2026, which means that current babies born, including my daughters due later this year, will be a minority in their own generation by 2031. So you would think that Reform want policies to not just stop that eventuality, but reverse that trend, including the reversal of the Islamification of our political system. And that includes banning halal and kosher slaughter, cracking down on Islamist mosques, banning face-veiling practices like the niqab and burqa, banning cousin marriage, and deporting not just the perpetrators, but the collaborators of the Pakistani grooming gangs. And that includes the family members who knew about the gangs and covered them up, who attacked victims at their trials, who, when speaking to journalists like Yasmin Alabhai-Brown in 2013, justified the crimes because they said white women sleep with everyone. By Allah, have you seen how immodestly they dress? Or this is revenge for colonialism. These people shouldn't be in our country. They should be deported. But again, this was one of the reasons that Farage gave for expelling Rupert Lowe earlier this year. Now, Nigel Farage has had an inconsistent position on this. In 2021, when the census data finally dropped, he said that it was outrageous that Manchester, Bradford, Birmingham, Luton, Leicester, and London were minority white British, which prompted former Home Secretary Sajid Javid to say, so what? Totally indifferent about our demographic obsolescence in the country that he supposedly calls his home. But then Nigel Farage in 2024 spoke to Stephen Edgington and said demographic change isn't a concern, and it's only cultural change, as if you could separate the culture from the people after whom the culture is named and to who it belongs. And then Richard Tice infamously told Stephen Edgington that the 2063 figure was a long way off and he'll be long gone by then, so he didn't care, which I think is inexcusable. Whereas Rupert Lowe explicitly talks in here about the white British population becoming a minority being something that should be impossible. And it's something that both Restore and Reform should work together on preventing. And it should be something that Nigel Farage now agrees with, considering he put out a Substack post, very lengthy, on anti-white racism, and towards the bottom, he said that if things aren't changed, the white British will be a minority in their own country, and they'll have nobody to speak up for them, and that Reform intend to be the party that acts in their interests. Okay, well, taking their side would constitute stopping them from becoming a minority in their own country, and so this should be another point that you could work together on. But conspicuously in Reform's responses to this pillar of the agreement has been omitted, and even attacked and demonised by the likes of Julia Hartley-Brewer as racist. It's very tiresome. So, this seems to be a sticking point, as well as, of course, banning kosher slaughter, because I don't think Reform, with a Friends of Israel and Jewish Alliance groups, and Nigel Farage in the aftermath of the Golders Green stabbing going to I think it was a kosher deli, and Layla Cunningham going to a kosher butcher, I don't think that will be something that Reform adopt anytime soon. Perhaps they might amend slaughterhouse laws to stop cheap foreign meat, or meat slaughters by foreign practices, from flooding British markets and violating animal welfare restrictions. Maybe there should be a labelling system, which Sarah Pochin has already supported. But it seems to be an impasse that they've reached. Rupert Lowe also demanded a referendum on the death penalty, and to give it to people like Axel Rudikabana, Vikram Digwa, Shabir Ahmed, the Rochdale grooming gang ringleader, and the surviving Abedi brother from the Manchester arena bombing. And this is a position that enjoys popular support among all age cohorts, especially when you specify which crimes that the recipients had committed. Terrorism, child abuse, mass murder. In consistent polls, this has been supported, and it's even been supported by Reform politicians, including Lee Anderson, Richard Tice, and I'm pretty sure that Zia Yusuf would volunteer to be executioner at this point. There are still concerns that some people have about the improper use of the death penalty by an enemy government, but if an appropriate, patriotic government that acted prudently, that's a very high standard of proof. For example, the Lee Rigby killers, they were on camera doing it, they're unrepentant for doing it, there's DNA evidence, they're at the scene, they're guilty as charged. Those people should be eligible for the death penalty. Anything that falls below that standard shouldn't. If you did that, then we would have a sense of just punishment again. We would restore the moral deficit we feel that our country is in. And even if Nigel Farage is not up for the idea, well, putting it to a referendum saves him from having to make that decision himself. And again, it would be a position that would win more votes than it would lose. The fourth was something that both parties can agree on, and that is restoring Britain's financial security. That means scrapping net zero, slashing tax and regulation, cutting the benefits bill. One of the problems that will arise is that Restore Britain, a day after this, published its economics paper, and they said we need to sunset the triple lock on pensions. And Reform have committed to that, with Robert Jenrick as their Treasury spokesman, though there might be a bit of room to manoeuvre on that particular front. And the final, and most difficult, value to agree on, is Rupert Lowe said, we don't want any more failed Tory ministers in cabinet. And this was perceived by Nigel Farage to be a slight to Robert Jenrick and Suella Braverman. But, as my friends at Lowe's have actually argued, there is room to manoeuvre here, not just for Rupert Lowe, who could retreat from this if there's a bit of a reshuffle done at Reform Conference or before forming government, and I'll get onto that in a moment, But also, if failed Tory ministers means the likes of Nadine Dorries and Nadhim Zahawi, the hated Boris Wave ministers who continue to defend everything Boris has done, Nadine Dorries is still lobbying for Boris Johnson to take back over the Conservative Party and form a pact with Reform. Why she's allowed in the party, I don't know. I know there are some people in Reform who would rather that particular defection was never celebrated, with fireworks and fanfare at their last conference, and hope that she leaves of her own accord. Nevertheless, it could well be that the prescription on Boris cabinet ministers joining Reform's cabinet could apply to the likes of Dorries and Zahawi, and we know that this is pertinent because Zahawi really wanted the Foreign Affairs brief, and that's why Reform don't have a Foreign Affairs spokesman, because they realised that even though they'd basically promised him it, they knew that their own voters would despise them if they did that. So that's why it's been left open, and that position has still yet to be filled. Now, I think all of this is a sensible opening offer from Rupert Lowe. And lots of people were saying, well, this is impossible, including some Reform surrogates in the media, and we'll get to their reaction in a moment. But a lot of that was just noise. The signal was the silence and the, well, we'll wait and see statements given by Reform's leadership, its MPs, and Nigel Farage himself. And I couldn't make a video on this because the last few days I've been hit by a medical emergency regarding my wife and my daughters. See the previous video on that. Thank you for all of your prayers and support for those who understand what my family is experiencing at this time. But I stayed relatively optimistic about this. And the reason is, back after the Makerfield by-election, this was 25th of June, I put out a very long post that garnered more attention than I expected, which began with thoughts on Restore Britain and Reform after this week. If Restore amounts to nothing more than a pressure campaign, then it has served its purpose. Because Restore Britain could have multiple purposes. Remember, it was founded as a non-partisan pressure campaign after Rupert Lowe's expulsion. It could act as Reform's nudge unit, forcing Reform to adopt policies that its base wants, that are popular with the public, that would win them an election, and are the necessary preconditions to fixing the country. Things like mass deportations, or cracking down on poorly licensed and dubious practices of non-stun and non-lethal stun slaughter in halal slaughterhouses across the country. People consuming halal meat that they object to eating but don't know they're consuming. And these things are, again, popular with the public and Reform's own voters. So it could be that they force Reform to adopt the policies that we want them to do and would fix the country. Or it could be they build up a significant enough electoral threat, and they've already reached that threshold because there are people in Reform that have told me, and have also told other journalists like Camilla Tominey of the Daily Tea podcast, Daily Telegraph, that, quote, if they get 4%, they'll kill us. And Restore Britain are consistently polling between 3 and 7%, and they just got about 46,000 votes in the Manchester mayoral election. I think they came fourth. They beat the Tories and the Lib Dems. So they have a significant share of the electorate to pose a threat to Reform's slim margins of victory, which has been slipping away from them for the last few weeks. And they have about 100,000 members, 130,000 at the last count, if I remember. And so all of those people would be at Reform's disposal, including the massive army of canvassers that Reform neglected, that showed up in Makerfield, that showed up in Great Yarmouth, that won them all 10 seats at the Great Yarmouth council and county council level. And Reform needs all the help it can get right now because, well, it's not like it was a year ago when they were riding high at 30% and looking to win a large majority. And so there is a significant benefit to Reform incorporating Restore Britain into its party as a parallel faction. There is also the proposal floated by Dan Tarbin and Carl Benjamin that the parties could continue to exist but not stand against one another, and in certain seats where it is unlikely for Nigel Farage to win because of personal dislike of him, regardless of what Reform do next, that Restore Britain could try to win those seats at a general election and form a minority partner in a coalition, but it seems that Reform really don't want a coalition government, and it seems redundant to have two parties if, truly, the party leadership agree on all the policies. It's just personalities getting in the way. And the reason that I'm optimistic about this, as I put in this post, is because after I put this post out, I, of course, spoke to my friends in Restore Britain. They said, look, we appreciate the friendly criticism. We're working on that stuff, and we appreciate that you can act as a friendly critic, telling us what we need to hear. But I also got a lot of messages from people in Reform, some quite senior. And they said, okay, thank you for the feedback. You were right in your criticisms, even though we didn't want to listen to it at the time. We consider you a critical friend of the party. And some people have always lamented that this split erupted between Restore and Reform, but more specifically, some of the people in Restore who they remain personal friends with. I mean, don't forget, in the years preceding both Restore and Reform, people like Charlie Downs and Harrison Pitt and myself were in regular contact with, but before they all fell out, people like Matt Goodwin, or my friend James Orr, who's head of policy over at Reform. We've spoken many times to some of Reform's MPs. But hell, I've met Farage a couple of times, and lots of people in Restore lament that they feel that Farage has dropped in their estimation because we've grown up watching him on television thinking, he's taken our side on things like Brexit and immigration. And he is really likeable, he's very charismatic, and he clearly has sway with a large amount of the electorate, including in Clacton, where he's going to storm to victory in his own by-election. So there's a great sadness that these rifts even exist. And there is a interest on both sides in healing them. And so it was great that Rupert Lowe came out and said, look, regardless of what happened with my expulsion from the party, regardless of you calling the police on me and raiding my house and taking my shotguns away and dragging my name through the mud with false dementia claims, like, despite me being positive towards Reform's output recently, including, Zia Yusuf, who I've been critical of in the past, that was a really dishonourable thing to do. But the fact that Rupert Lowe said, we can set that aside, get past it, work together, that's magnanimous, that's encouraging, and it's what quite a few people in Reform actually wanted to hear. And so there are multiple positives for Reform working with Restore. So they gain Rupert Lowe and his credibility and his social media following on issues that Reform has lost credibility on, namely mass deportations, Islam, and the grooming gangs, through some faux pas or unfulfilled promises or bad interviews. And if Reform, by the way, wants to regain credibility on that ground, they also need to run those interviews back, basically do the Stephen Edgington interview all over again, but answer the questions right this time, so people have clips to contrast with your old clips and say, well, that stuff is out of date, and they've shown contrition, they've accepted feedback, and they now understand what time it is. So just a little hint. It also nullifies the threat to Reform's right, and that consolidates 4 to 7% of the national vote, a few 100,000 members, and it will make you decisively competitive again against Andy Burnham. That doesn't mean that all Restore voters would hop over to Reform. There are people who still think that Reform isn't in significant shape. It doesn't trust Reform after the Tory defections, or Nigel Farage's flip-flopping on certain policies. Or there are some people that, like John Cleese or Duncan Bannatyne, who trust in Rupert Lowe, but think that Nigel Farage is a charlatan or a sort of car salesman. And this isn't me being pejorative, it's just those are people that you have yet to win over. It also gains Restore's team, and I think that's a significant asset. The lads who are writing policy and punching well above their weight despite not having a HQ or Reform's treasure chest of donations, or its vast network of satellite organisations and GB News and the Prosperity Institute. And again, I'm not throwing shade at those people. There are some great people working in those institutes that are my friends, but the fact that Restore Britain are doing work that is admired by those outlets on a shoestring budget with nothing more than basically their smarts and friendship means that they would be well disposed to be placed in the Reform system if they weren't just going to be contained or have their revolutionary energy diffused. If they actually were harnessed to the benefit of Reform, then it would be to the benefit of the party and the country. And there are certainly people in Reform who wish that was the case and would like to make that happen. But again, the insurmountable barrier is personal dislike between Nigel Farage and Rupert Lowe. If that can be overcame, fantastic. It also then nullifies the arguments that both Restore Britain exists to split the right-wing vote, deny Reform a victory out of vengeance, and the people that were complaining that Restore was splitting the vote now don't really have much to complain about when Restore say, okay, let's work together then. I mean, you should just want to incorporate them, but lots of the same people are now saying it's a poison chalice, it's a fake deal, it's to make Rupert Lowe look good and Nigel Farage look bad because he knows it can't happen, and Restore are a racist party, they're too far right and we don't want them. It's like, okay, so you're splitting the vote, or do you rejecting unity on like moral and personality grounds? Because now you look like you're the problem. And it also rehabilitates Nigel Farage's image regarding his leadership style, because the accusations have been that Nigel Farage falls out with people frequently, to the point of when Nigel Farage, in the press conference addressing the deal, said, well, there is this narrative that I fall out with everyone, but I don't. People fall out with me. And it's like, okay, look, I get it. Nigel Farage has main character energy. It's undeniable, right? I don't, and I still experience this where I just have people crash out at me for the things that I say sometimes and I'm just perplexed. So maybe that truly is his experience of his relationships. But it is true there is a trail of bodies with knives in their backs, politically speaking, behind Nigel Farage's career, including Robert Kilroy-Silk and Stephen Wolfe and Susan Evans to an extent, and Ben Habib and Rupert Lowe. And look, there is certainly a post-Farage crash-out syndrome where some of those figures go on to fade into obscurity, or reveal themselves to have some really balmy ideas. Like, for some reason, Ben Habib is still going around calling Restore Britain racist, despite saying he wanted to work with Restore Britain, despite saying he wanted to campaign in Makerfield and try and make himself Restore's deputy, and complaining that Rupert Lowe didn't have a formal pact with him. Anyway, quite an unstable individual, it seems, and that's quite sad. Nevertheless, it would be excellent if Nigel Farage could reverse 2 fallouts in 1 year, because of course now Douglas Carswell, and I know Douglas, he's a nice guy, former Conservative, then UKIP MP, who fell out with Farage famously, and they're now good friends, and they see each other in DC whenever they pop over there, and Douglas Carswell does interviews supporting Reform's efforts. It would be great if he could also rehabilitate his relationship with Rupert Lowe and bring that group into the fold, all the talent that is behind Rupert and the goodwill along with it, and then Nigel would overcome the accusation, much like Donald Trump did, actually, that he falls out with people he's too brash and disagreeable to be a unifier and a real leader. And Lowe would also act as, and I hate using this term, but it is the term that was used in the 2024 election for Donald Trump, assassination insurance. Because Nigel Farage's life is constantly under threat. It's one of the reasons he took those donations from George Cottrell and Christopher Harborne to pay for his security. His daughter's house has been splashed all over the pages of the Times and Sky News. He's had multiple threats on his life thwarted. He had a milkshake and concrete thrown at him during the 2024 election campaign. And of course, we've just had his friend, Reform spokeswoman, former Conservative MP, Anne Widdecombe, murdered. And her killer, allegedly, is a crazy leftist with newspaper clippings all over his apartment and gave Leninist speeches at trade union meetings before. And it's conspicuous that Hope Not Hate then deleted their page detailing Anne Widdecombe's vile rhetoric on things like transgenderism and not supporting same-sex marriage as a Catholic. It's not an exaggeration to say that Nigel Farage is probably the highest profile political figure in the country and has the most threats against his life. And so it's beneficial not to just keep him safe and, God forbid anything happens to him, not just because I like him, he's a nice guy, he's fun to be around, but because he's a husband and a father and a grandfather, and fundamentally, despite people's perceived shortcomings of him and his stumbles in previous interviews, he's a patriot, he's trying. Nothing should happen to him, but it could. And so the thing that would make would-be assassins most afraid is if the most right-wing man in Britain, according to Alistair Campbell, Lord of the Dark Arts himself, were waiting in the wings as someone who would gain more power if Nigel Farage vanished. Remember Nigel Farage, I think it was last year, gave an interview to the Times and said, look, I'm the last chance at a democratic solution. If you think I'm bad, wait till what comes after me. If the looming threat of Rupert Lowe is assassination insurance, much in the same way that J.D. Vance was assassination insurance as vice president for President Trump in the last election, then that would be good. It would put the fear of God into our shared enemies. This comes at a vital time, this bargaining chip by Rupert Lowe. Because as I said, Reform have slumped in the polls. So they were leading in over 300 consecutive opinion polls. And then YouGov, after Andy Burnham's installation as Prime Minister, puts Labour and Reform on neck and neck. They're both on 22%, and this was in late July, the 26th to the 27th. Now, they've since recovered their 1%. They're back up to 23, and Labour's on 22, but again, that's basically a rounding error. Between 1%, between the parties, neither of them gets an outright majority in government, and you only have the exit polls to rely on to wonder who wins. That's not a position Reform want to find themselves in. Now, the reason that they have been rising is because immigration continues to be a rising and number 1 or 2 salient issue in the public mind. Immigration and the economy are now neck and neck at 48%. And immigration is something the Labour government won't solve. It's actually something that Andy Burnham doesn't want to talk about because his northern vibe-coded campaign doesn't want to speak about negative things, and endless migrant rapes and murders aren't exactly tickety-boo for Mr. Bucket Hat. And also, they have no credible plan to alleviate it. Instead, they're just going to make it worse because they're inventing new safe and legal routes for Afghans and Eritreans and Somalis and Palestinians and Pakistanis to come into the country, get full university scholarships at taxpayers' expense, be sponsored as chain migrants by mosques and faith communities, and that we have to pay for the pleasure of importing more terrorists and rapists and murderers into our midst. And that's what Labour's doing, despite, again, in every election for the last 50 years, us voting against such a policy. So, Reform and Restore both have credibility on the issue. I mean, Reform just did a press conference, not just on stopping the boats, but on sending them back to France. And people said, oh, you can't do that. The French won't accept it. It'll be illegal. I mean, one, legal analysis says that it can be done. And two, there's a reason that Jordan Bardella, the Prime Minister of France, under Marine Le Pen, who's now eligible to run for president again, is speaking at Reform's conference in September. Number one, because, you know, he's a patriot and he had a Call of Duty YouTube channel and he's very popular with the ladies, so he's likely to get elected. But number two, it's because Reform will be dealing with him and he wants to solve the problem too for the French as well as the Brits. Like, he sees us as one civilization with one struggle. And so, if you have a cooperative French government, it makes it much easier. I mean, it's not long until Reform goes from stop the boats to sink the boats at this rate if we're deploying the Navy. But of course, we're on YouTube, so we couldn't endorse such a thing. Nevertheless, Reform can recover from its stagnant poll lead, but it needs every advantage it can get. And in other polls as well, it isn't showing them recovering. I mean, Opinion has Labour at 27% and Reform at 23%. Now again, I think that's a bit of an outlier, but it's not encouraging when Labour are surging in the polls before Andy Burnham has to own the mistakes of the system that he has endorsed as a Blairite, a Brownite, a Corbynite, a Starmerite, and now Manchesterism, which just means more spending on foreign aid, more spending on trams and buses up north, and increasing deficit spending to hand off a fiscal time bomb to Reform, presumably. Nevertheless, another Southport will happen, and he won't be able to respond robustly enough to it. Nigel Farage will probably give a dignified statesman speech like he did after the murder of Henry Novak, and Reform will start to recover again. But will they recover enough for an outright parliamentary majority, which they need to get all of their repeals and radical changes past Parliament and the Lords? Given you're in a difficult position, you need every advantage you can get, and Restore Britain can provide those advantages. And then a more in common poll that just dropped just before I recorded this video. By the way, I recorded this video a day ago, and not only did so many things change in the meantime that it warranted recording again, but for some reason my drivers for my graphics card like shit the bed, and OBS recorded it really choppy, so the audio was great, but the video was unusable. So you're getting me giving it a second take. Anyway, More in Common says Labour are also on 27% and Reform are on 24%, with the Conservatives nipping at their heels at 22%. And I tell you right now, all the best people in Reform, and anyone with any sense in the country, does not want a Conservative Reform pact. There are people in Reform who insist on breathing new life into the Conservatives. They should be expelled from Reform, and every available opportunity should be taken to prevent that from happening, which includes, I think, working with Restore Britain. And the accusation that Restore Britain are working with the Conservatives, I'll get onto that later. But it's just not true. I mean, the timeline doesn't add up. Meetings are being fabricated that didn't even happen, according to sources like Nadine Dorries, who wants Boris to be in coalition with Farage, and that's the only reason she's in Reform, is to save her own failing political career and act as cheerleader for the boyfriend she never had. And also, the idea that a party populated by Harrison Pitt, Charlie Downs, and, you know, with myself being friendly with them, would be open to working with the Conservatives when we've said that Kemi Badenoch is a Nigerian anchor baby who has used white as a pejorative and shouldn't be allowed anywhere near government or parliament, let alone again. Yeah, that's pretty farcical, because, you know, they're banned for life from the Conservatives. So, it doesn't really stick as an accusation. But there's also the intention to get rid of Farage. This is why I talked about assassination insurance. I don't just mean physical assassination insurance. I mean sort of career security. Because Farage is fighting this by-election in Clacton, presuming there's going to be another one, because the Times, parliamentary procedures, the National Crime Agency are trying to weaponise donations against him. And these donations are from his friends Christopher Harborne and Posh George Cottrell. And the Times has just come out with a new piece saying, actually, Nigel Farage was contemplating coming back as the leader of Reform all the way back in May, well before the July general election timeline, where he was going to go off to America and then announce he was coming back as leader and ran in Clacton. And so this means the donations made by Cottrell and Harborne are expressly political. Now, whether or not they are, it doesn't matter. Whether or not Nigel Farage had taken different legal advice and actually reported all these donations to the Parliamentary Standards Office, I still would have gone after him anyway. He's in the same position that Trump was in 2022 or 2023, where they're raiding Melania's underwear drawer in Mar-a-Lago, and Alvin Bragg and Fannie Willis and E. Jean Carroll are filing frivolous lawsuits and charges against him. This is essentially Farage's mugshot, and God forbid we get a Butler, Pennsylvania scenario on our hands. So they need to understand that they need the broadest tent, the most credible team possible, and they need to take the steeliest spined position against the media that is trying to ruin Farage's life. He's already done some of this with his announcement that he was going to be standing down as an MP and running in Clacton. It was an excellent speech, and it's very much saying the media are the enemy. But that posture would be bolstered by having Rupert Lowe, who tells journalists who call him all the names under the sun, I don't care. Also, Richard Tice is facing an investigation as well. And this is significant because Richard Tice is probably tipped as the person best positioned to take over from Farage, even though Zia Yusuf is one of the most popular among the membership. And depending on the polls that you look at, I think with Lord Ashcroft it was Richard Tice, but that's not really surprising because Isabel Oakeshott works with Lord Ashcroft, and Isabel Oakeshott is, of course, Tice's fiancée, I think, now. And then, in another poll that was reported by The Spectator, Zia Yusuf is second at 14%, but 37% of Reform voters, when asked, say, I don't know who should take over from Farage, because they don't conceive of a reform without Nigel Farage as its figurehead. It would be useful to have Rupert Lowe in there to fill out the team to ensure, not that he takes over from Farage, because nowhere in Rupert Lowe's offer was a promise to supersede Nigel Farage as leader or even question Farage's leadership of reform. But he would lower the drawbridge to the next generation of political talent to come into reform. There's a piece by Dan Hodges in the Mail, and again, he's an anti-Farage partisan, despite previously working for Hope Not Hate and being the liaison that Gawain Towler, Nigel Farage's former right-hand man, used to have Hope Not Hate vet UKIP's candidates in the 2015 general election. Hope Not Hate are open borders communists, and using them is a serious question of judgment. And given Gawain Towler is, as we'll get onto momentarily, opposed to this merger, I don't think he's worthy of listening to. Though I have been told that despite Gawain being on Reform's advisory board, he has no actual sway over party policy and has instead been relegated to touring the pubs of Westminster and writing his Substack posts every day with ChatGPT. Anyway, Dan Hodges reports in here from Reform sources. Now, it's possible he could have made them up, but I suspect not. I think this is the Tory defector crowd that would like people like Zia Yusuf and James Orr out of the picture so that they can perform political necromancy on the Tory party, force a Tory Reform merger, and reanimate the corpse of the Conservatives. But Hodges quotes a Reform member who wasn't pulling any punches. There's no way Nigel puts this behind him now. The 5 million quid isn't going away. George Cottrell isn't going away. I don't understand what he was thinking, but it doesn't matter. I don't see how we move on from it. Bear in mind, most people in the country aren't paying attention to this story. It's a very Westminster bubble story. Most people don't care. Most people think, if they're supporting reform or likely to support reform, as circumstances conspire to make support for them more palatable, that if Nigel Farage is going to get rid of all the dodgy immigrants that are from the Horn of Africa and India but are polluting their high streets and making their daughters feel unsafe, if he's going to cut taxes, if he's going to make their energy bills more affordable, if he's going to make Britain feel like it belongs to them again, they don't care what money he's getting from who. So I think that's incorrect. Nevertheless, another Reform insider was equally scathing of their leader. The Clacton stunt was madness. He's totally marginalised himself in the party. Recess is the moment we traditionally capitalise, but we're nowhere. We're just talking to ourselves. Even 3 months ago, such seditious talk would have been unthinkable. There were tensions and factions inside Reform, as there are inside all parties, but they were confined to backbiting among Farage's lieutenants, MPs and activists, a sort of squabbling under King Lear for who might have the crown. Instead, criticism of Farage himself was essentially confined to eye-rolling over his timekeeping, but now senior members of the party are starting to think the unthinkable. Quote, Nigel isn't immortal, one said. What he's done is incredible, but there's a limit to what one man can achieve. So the idea is, we start jockeying for position while Nigel Farage looks weak. And so Nigel Farage needs allies around him who want him to remain as leader. And I don't think Rupert Lowe would actually question that, but he would make people think twice about getting rid of Farage because a sizable portion of the membership, and including, over 100,000 members that would make their way into Reform if Reform and Restore were to merge, would want Rupert Lowe as the backup. And this would mean that Nigel Farage's place as the party leader would actually be more secure because they would be worried about Rupert Lowe taking over instead. Anyway, you can see the contours of this concerted effort to get rid of Farage as Reform's leader in this article. The breakdown in Farage's personal standing has resulted in an implosion of Reform's discipline. Zia Yusuf, the party's Home Affairs spokesman, was described to me by one insider as completely out of control. The press office have no idea what he's going to do or say. Yeah, that's why a lot of Reform voters actually quite like him these days. In all fairness, Zia Yusuf is probably the strongest rhetorician on immigration and reform, and it's weirdly advantageous that he's been given the Home Office brief, despite mine and others' previous scepticism of him, especially for what happened with Rupert Lowe. As for Farage's inner circle, Hodges writes, long-standing suspicion has turned into a concrete belief that there is a traitor in their midst. Seems that way if people have been leaking financial records, constantly talking to the press, telling the Observer that Zia Yusuf should be expelled. I think that was Tim Montgomery, by the way. At least that's what I've heard. And also, they're talking to you, Dan, who is trying to engage in obvious subterfuge to try and scupper Reform's chances. So, yeah, there clearly are traitors in Reform that either want to see Reform sabotaged or converted into the Tories 2.0. According to one source, someone said, someone is out to get Nigel. The stuff people are getting on the finances is too detailed, we got a rat on the inside, as well as in the National Crime Agency who have been leaking Nigel Farage and Richard Tice's business dealings to The Guardian. The result is the number of people trusted to make decisions has shrunk to a tiny core of acolytes. I can think of 5 or 6 people that are properly around Farage, that are trusted, that are loyalists, and again, agree with everything that Rupert said in that announcement video, that he wanted to work together. So those are encouraging signs. It's the other people in the party that are jockeying for position that are trying to make it impossible. So just so you understand the faction wars and the contours of the personality conflicts that are going on within the party. Nigel should be devolving decision-making, one former ally told him, but instead everything's becoming more centralised and secretive. It's unsustainable. Within Westminster, there's a settled narrative that if Farage is forced to walk away from politics, Reform are effectively finished, but the opposite in reality is true. Unless Reform find a way to move on from Farage, they are doomed. So if Dan Hodges is saying, get rid of Farage because he actually wants Labour to win, then it means that anyone who is talking to Hodges under conditions of anonymity and bad-mouthing Farage from within Reform are traitors in your midst. So how could Reform pull off this deal with Restore? Well, just look at the example put forward by Donald Trump and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. ahead of the 2024 presidential election. They were rivals, they ran against each other. RFK called Trump all sorts of mean names, and yet he still invited RFK on stage with fireworks and incorporated the Make America Healthy Again agenda into MAGA's broader party political platform, which contributed in no small part to Trump not just winning every branch of government, but also the popular vote. So there is a model for expanding your tent, incorporating old allies, showing yourself to be magnanimous. I mean, J.D. Vance wanted to call Trump Hitler, and now he's not just Trump's VP pick, but still the favourite among the Republican base for the next president of the United States. So what opportunity do Reform have to facilitate this return of the prodigal son that is Rupert Lowe? Well, they've already told James Heal of The Spectator that at party conference, they plan to announce new shadow cabinet positions. They plan to fill it out with spokespeople for foreign affairs and defence. The one they don't mention there is justice, but they say 2 or 3 more will come at conference. Now, there is the feeling, going back to Rupert Lowe's suggestion that we don't have any more failed Tory ministers in cabinet, there is the feeling that while Suella Braverman has atoned for her time as Home Secretary failing to prevent the Boris wave in Rishi Sunak's government, that she did try, she was transparent about her efforts, and she has since come out and explained the laws and civil servants and Conservative politicians that got in the way of reducing migration, that insisted it had to continue increasing, that flew the trans pride flag over government buildings, and that Rishi Sunak blocked her from doing so. So there is a feeling that Suella Braverman has sufficiently atoned for her shortcomings in the Conservative government. She was the Attorney General during lockdown, and she did excuse the government's ability to bring all of society to a standstill, and she also, I believe, voted for vaccine passports. Nevertheless, she doesn't have as many problems as Robert Jenrick does, because Robert Jenrick was Immigration Minister during the Boris wave, and he facilitated the Afghan settlement scheme and wrote in the Telegraph that Afghans are our new neighbours. And he also celebrated the rubber stamping of approval for Sudanese asylum seekers and praised it in Parliament. And this resulted in the murder of Wayne Broadhurst. It's resulted in the attempted beheading of Stephen Ogilvy in Northern Ireland. It's resulted in lots of rapes and murders and costs imposed upon the British people, and thousands of Taliban fighters and drug addicts and Islamic radicals coming into our country and being a ticking terrorist time bomb. And Robert Jenrick hasn't addressed that yet. And he is also being played out of position. He's a lawyer who's currently the Treasury spokesman, and he's made some announcements that haven't been popular with Reform's own base, especially young people, including the triple lock on pensions and the preservation of the Office for Budget Responsibility as an independent quango, as well as the functional independence of the Bank of England, which means they're both unaccountable and they both work in concert against Reform's agenda. And Reform will, unless it repopulates those institutions with its own people, but then that would challenge their institutional neutrality if they tried to do that, they will try to hand them faulty briefs, bad modelling, or they will leak to the press to try to sabotage their economic plans. So that seems unpopular and unworkable, and it seems that Jenrick isn't playing to his strengths, because the reason he became popular was all the videos he made while Shadow's Justice Minister competing for the Conservative Party leadership. And so it would be sensible for Jenrick to be rotated out to a shadow justice spokesperson role, because he spends half his time doing that anyway. So that would vacate the Treasury position. If you want to be really bold and make use of another benefit of the acquisition of Rupert Lowe, which would be his seat on the Public Accounts Committee, grilling civil servants with clips that go viral on public waste and spending, manufacturing further consent for Danny Kruger's plans to scrap the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, fire most of the civil service, and rehire it with a bunch of patriots that are committed to reform's agenda, then why not make a person on the Public Accounts Committee your Treasury spokesperson? It would make perfect sense if you wanted to maximise a reform-restore merger. But of course, the thing that's getting in the way is still the animosity between Nigel Farage and Rupert Lowe, and the opposition that's being put up by Reform's own spokespeople. And these include their sort of second-tier surrogates. So Gwaine Towler wrote a dreadful piece using, again, ChatGPT, that said that it was impossible to facilitate the merger because Rupert Lowe wants to ban halal and kosher slaughter. I mean, just look at the cadence of the piece. This is not an open hand. It comes with preconditions. Reform is asked to reverse course on a list of positions, among them a referendum on the death penalty and a ban on halal and kosher slaughter. Both are settled restore policy. Both are known to be positions Reform are unlikely to take. That's not an olive branch. That's a demand, engineered to be refused, offered in public so the refusal can be filmed. It's the oldest move in the book, and it's not even well disguised. Lowe is not asking Farage to unite the right. He is asking Farage to become Rupert Lowe, and then intends to spend the autumn touring the studios explaining that he, Rupert the bigger man, tried. It is self-serving nonsense. 1, you missed a full stop at the end. 2, the "it's not this, it's that" cadence style gives away the fact that you didn't properly write this, did you, Gwaine? Which explains your prolific turnaround of an article a day. And thirdly, this is just 2010s David Cameron multiculturalism. It turns out that these aren't the positions that Reform's own voters want, and so if they want to increase their share of the public vote, 45% want legal migrants returned home as well as illegals. The majority of Reform voters do not think that Britain is a nation of values. They think it's an ethnic community. They think that you can't be truly British unless you are born British, descended from British people. According to Raiku Darling, Dame Sarah Khan's polling recently, a majority of Brits think diversity is destroying British identity, also want remigration, and those are in the 80% among Reform voters, including those who think that Muslims can never integrate into British society. That's upwards of 80% of Reform voters, according to Dame Sarah Khan and YouGov polling. All of these things refute your libtarded worldview. And you are a liberal, Gwaine, because of your previous pieces that says that Reform stands for inclusive, multicultural, modern, diverse Britain, and that we need Anglican Muslims and Sikhs and Jews and Hindus who believe their faith sincerely but practice it privately as if they can somehow divorce their beliefs about death and the afterlife, human nature and morality from their politics and their identity. It's just not how the rest of the world do things, and it's not how, sincerely Christian people do things either. Anyway, this just clangs like dropped cutlery. But this is clearly the consternation of a faction in Reform that want to block this merger because they feel that their politics and their interests are under threat if Restore and its supporters are accommodated. Darren Grimes did the same thing. He wrote a piece that has an AI-generated image of Rupert Lowe as like a Roman centurion, which kind of goes hard, to be honest. Darren says, "I hear you, but watch the full 12-minute monologue. Sacked Braveman and Jenrick." He didn't say that. "Accept our terms. What terms do we get in return?" Silence. Rupert Lowe left the terms deliberately open so that Reform has the power to set the terms of the negotiation. It's actually putting Reform in a strong position. 5 demands, no offer, and a man who knows the answer. Patriotic peace deal? No, this is a press release. Alex Phillips, again, said, "What are you even offering? To self-eviscerate and disband? I hear you had a big fallout the other week with your chums." She's saying, the Conservatives. "Feeling a little on your own?" She's getting that from Nadine Dorries, by the way. Dorries has long claimed that Restore and the Conservatives have a secret pact. And she said that actually, I have it on good authority, a secret meeting was held on Sunday, July the 26th, between Rupert Lowe and representatives of the Conservative Party. My impeccable sources tell me it was only the latest in a series of meetings over the last year, which had laid the ground for the creation of a detailed policy agreement designed to form the basis of a Conservative alliance between the Tories and Restore. I've been told that Lowe's price was his elevation to the Lords in the eventual position of Deputy Prime Minister. Naturally, the Conservative representatives rejected this demand out of hand, and the Restore leader brought the rendezvous to an abrupt and colourful end, delivering such spicy epithets on his way out that I'm told he has totally burnt his bridges with his would-be allies. Both the Tories and Restore told the Daily Mail yesterday no such talks had taken place. Rupert Lowe refuted this by saying, "Nice try, Nadine, but I spent the morning of Sunday the 26th travelling out of the country. There was no water at Gatwick. You're sounding increasingly deranged, which is impressive from such a high starting point." Also, Nadine Dorries isn't opposed to a coalition with the Conservatives. She's just opposed to Restore working with the Conservatives, which they don't want to, which would cause all Restore supporters to abandon Rupert in droves, because she wants Reform to work the Conservatives instead and rehabilitate Boris's career. Because she wrote, "It's now time for the Tories to act. They've spent a year channeling their energy into forming an alliance with Restore in order to crush Reform, but they need to refocus, put personalities aside, stop sniping at Reform, and negotiate with its charismatic vote-winning leader to lay the foundations of an unbeatable alliance." Right, so she wants a Reform Tory pact. She wants it with Boris and Farage. So she's only mad in her fevered imagination about things that didn't happen, that Rupert Lowe might form an alliance with the Tories, because it would stop the Tories from getting into government with Reform, which is what she actually wants. So she shouldn't be trusted, she'd be totally discounted, because she is a liar and ill-motivated. Then you had Isabel Oakeshott, who again is the fiancée of Richard Tice, going repeatedly on Talk TV saying, "The offer is purely theatrics, the two men can't stand each other, I don't see some kind of merger between Reform and Restore, it's impossible." Now remember, Isabel Oakeshott knew of Rupert Lowe's expulsion from the party under those terrible circumstances ahead of time, because she was on Talk TV gloating, saying, "Oh, poor Rupert, he doesn't understand how politics works," when Rupert Lowe did an interview with Andrew Pearce and said, "Yeah, sure, Nigel Farage is the messiah, he leads Reform, but we need more spokespeople and a credible policy plan if we're going to say that we're the next government to the electorate," and, you know, that's what Reform has been doing in the years since. So it seems that Rupert was right, and it seems that actually you have terrible political instincts, Isabel, because you weren't expecting Restore Britain to form and present a credible threat to Reform winning a national majority, which isn't the express purpose of Restore, but it just happens to be the case that if you're competing for the same voters, they won't vote for Reform if they're persuaded by Restore. So it seems that actually it was you who had the terrible political instincts. And by the way, Isabel Oakeshott thought it was great to butter up Matt Hancock and write his book for him. So clearly she doesn't have that many scruples with working with strange characters. So working with Matt Hancock is fine, but Nigel Farage and Rupert Lowe working together, setting the differences aside, is somehow impossible. She's also got a brand new show on Talk that positively tens of people will watch, I'm sure. And again, she's saying the two of them just can't work together. She is insistent on trying to block this deal, as is Matt Goodwin. Matt Goodwin put out a Substack post today and said, "Reform should avoid a pact with Restore. The path to power does not through Restore's 4%. It runs through millions of Tory, Labour and none of the above voters. For every one Restore voter, there are 3 Lib Dems, 5 Tories, 6 Labour and 10 non-voters." Sorry, let me just get this straight here. I don't wish to strawman. Matt Goodwin's strategy is for Reform UK to court Lib Dem and Labour voters over the 100,000 Restore members and the provable 46,000 in the Manchester mayoral election, the 7% in Makerfield. That's delusional, because that would require Reform to liquidate its policy offering to such an extent they're indistinguishable from the Uniparty. And that's something that lost Reform points because they were celebrating defectors from Labour, the Lib Dems, the Greens and the Tories for the last year. And Reform actually acknowledged that at the head table. So Matt Goodwin is giving Reform advice that is tantamount to sabotage here. I can only understand this as the continued crash out that he's having since losing in Gorton and Denton and publishing his AI book. But actually, if you wanted to win any of those voters over, what Reform should be doing is setting out its stall with the most credible policy offering and consistent position possible. And when events outpace those insane ideologies of diversity and multiculturalism and indefinite liberalism and human rights proposed by Labour, the Tories and the Lib Dems, when people are made converts through circumstance, then Reform will be there waiting for them. You don't go and meet people where they are, which requires you to move to this mythical centre ground, and the centre means millions of immigrants from the third world every year, or laughing at mass deportations, as Matt Goodwin decided to do in recent interviews with Winston Marshall, the New Culture Forum, and Peter McCormack. It means having integrity, having credibility, having consistency, and leading so that other people can see they can follow you with conviction. You then had Brendan O'Neill, who I imagine was perturbed particularly by Restore Britain's reluctance to participate in the Iran war and their opposition to non-stun slaughter, because Israel is his number one issue as an Irishman for some reason. And he says Reform should avoid this olive branch like the plague. He thinks it's, again, a bad faith offering, a poison chalice. I would just suggest that very serious person Brendan O'Neill, who called Restore supporters a bunch of virgins and nerds and basement dwellers when he thought it was wise to wear a fedora indoors in the 2010s, probably isn't the best person to be giving advice on how to win an election, especially because he works for Spiked Online, which was formerly Living Marxism, who do not give a damn about open borders. So again, advice is tantamount to sabotage. And then you've got Raheem Kassam, who is Nigel Farage's former advisor from the UKIP days. Raheem is sort of reform's advocate in Washington, D.C. And look, I've never met Raheem. I don't have any problem with the guy. And also, I'm not looking to get banned from Butterworth's. It's a great restaurant, lovely fries. So, don't punish me. But Raheem has been very against this idea. And he posted, initially, Rupert Lowe is polling nationally on 1% and has made a multi-camera scripted video asking if he can work with Reform again. I mean, that's just not true. They're polling above 1%, and even Reform acknowledge this. So there's no reason to start out with a falsehood. It just makes your argument less convincing. He says, instead of sending a text or picking up the phone, he's done what he's always done, try and get himself a little attention. Well, being fair, there hasn't exactly been lines of dialogue open between Reform and Restore for quite some time. And one of Rupert's complaints in his interview with Andrew Pierce was that he was trying to get meetings with Farage about policy when he was in the party, and Farage's itinerary was so full that they weren't a priority. So he's leveraging his significant shared public audience with Reform and saying, look, I'll take the first step to say all is forgiven on the expulsion front. Let's get past our personal animosity and work together. And that's good. But instead, Raheem complains that he makes policy demands of Reform. I mean, I'm sure those can be negotiated. Much like Trump and the art of the deal, you make your demands and then the other person meets you if you have something they want. And he says he just complains about Rupert and the grooming gangs, and he says that if he wants to come back to Reform, we need to write a letter of apology to the party staff he abused. No, it wasn't just Zia Yusuf. And we all know that's an undertaking to which he won't commit. And actually, Raheem Kassam, during the press conference that Nigel Farage and Zia Yusuf gave about their plan to send migrants in small boats back to France, asked a question and decided to stir the pot and try to provoke Rupert Lowe by demanding that Rupert Lowe apologise to Nigel Farage as a condition of coming back to Reform. And Nigel Farage said, well, I'm not expecting an apology, but it would be nice.
In terms of Rupert Lowe, wouldn't it have been better, rather than him doing a 12-minute video, very well produced, interesting music bed and all of that, to just start by saying to the people that he abused in Reform the words, I'm sorry?
Well, look, as far as that's concerned, Restore have spent most of their time attacking Reform and attacking Reform individuals endlessly, relentlessly. They haven't until now criticised the Conservatives at all. There was some kind of deal between the two. Don't ask me what it was. I just know that it erupted and blew up last week. So you might see a change of tack on that. There is this myth. There is this myth that I fell out with Rupert Lowe. It's not true. Everyone fell out with Rupert Lowe. And it was the screaming, the shouting, the threatening, the legal writs. Everyone fell out with him. All right. But look, if you have to speak to people or make arrangements with people that you've previously fallen out with, if there is a greater good to be had from that, then I'm not closing my mind to it. Sorry would be nice, but I would have thought unlikely to be forthcoming.
And it looks like Farage was trying to be light-hearted there, and again, he refused to rule it out. Farage had said that he was open to a deal with Rupert Lowe, but it seems to have rubbed Rupert Lowe up the wrong way, because that afternoon, Dan Wootton hosted Rupert Lowe for an interview for half an hour, and Rupert Lowe just defaulted back to insulting Nigel Farage and Zia Yusuf again.
Would you say sorry, Rupert?
Well, I think that's a sort of narcissistic arrogance that you'd expect from Nigel. No, I didn't throw any stones. They made false witness statements, and it was done without any prior discussion. As for the screaming and shouting, that's just palpable rubbish. I've run multiple family businesses. I get on with people, they work for us most of their lives often. So a lot of the stuff they talk about is rubbish. And Mohammed Zia Yusuf, appeared from nowhere. He seems to have done untold damage to the structures within Reform. And if you listen to people from within Reform, it's him who's not a team player. And Nigel himself is very aloof. He doesn't talk to people or include people. He expects to sit at the top of the tree, issue edict, and for people to deliver. Well, that's not how teams work, Dan. Teams work when you bring people together, you involve them, and you have what I call an inclusive management structure. But I guess it's not surprising that Nigel wouldn't understand that, because he's never actually run a business or done anything which involves bringing people together to actually work together constructively. So look, I don't want to fall out with the guy. I've made an effort to work with him, but for him to start throwing that kind of nonsense, no, I've got nothing to apologize for.
That's really unhelpful, especially when during the press conference, Zia Yusuf actually said, in response to a question asked about the supposed threats made to him 3 months before he reported Rupert Lowe to the police, that no, I don't feel threatened by Rupert. Whatever happened is in the past, and it's not about me. It's about fixing the country. And so if we can work together, I'm all for that.
Are you frightened of Rupert?
Well, look, specifically, because I was asked this already, I think this morning, my feelings towards Rupert are not remotely relevant relative to the fate of the country and the millions, tens of millions of British people around this country who want secure borders, who want an end to illegal immigration, who want mass deportation of illegal immigrants, who want the upholding of law and order, want taxes to come down, all of the things that I know Restore voters, a lot of Conservative voters and Reform voters all want. That is what matters.
And it's additionally unhelpful because then Raheem Kassam went and gloated about the fact that Rupert Lowe was insulting Zia Yusuf and Nigel Farage, yet again complaining about the false police report and the raiding of his house, which, remember, Rupert Lowe said he wanted to get past. So the onus is on you to forget about it if you say, I want to put that in the past to work together. Don't allow the people that are trying to drive a wedge between you when you're trying to work out a deal to actually be able to drive that wedge. Because Kassam can just turn around and say, Lowe is attacking senior Reform figures, attacking Nigel and his own idea of being able to work together. Rupert Lowe is a nasty, sliveling narcissist, and he just consigned himself to the dustbin of history where he belongs. Don't give them the satisfaction. And to Zia Yusuf's credit, and to the credit of most of Reform's actual leadership, this line was consistent on TV. Ian Collins asked Zia Yusuf, I think it was on Monday, whether or not he'd be willing to work with Rupert Lowe. He also appeared on the BBC, which I happened to catch while I was sat in the hospital waiting room with my wife. And he was consistent and saying, of course, we're willing to engage with other parties and talk to people from other parties, and that includes Rupert Lowe. Well done. Zia has been consistent and principled on this, despite the animosity between the two. Andrew Rosendale was actually the first Reform MP to be asked about this on Sunday morning on Camilla Tominey's show on GB News, and he responded to the question about cooperation between Reform and Restore, put to him by Emily Carver, by saying, look, if anyone can bring these two parties together, I'm all for it. Rupert Lowe and I probably agree on many things, and that's despite him being, a former Conservative MP that defected to Reform, and that would preclude him, if the terms that Rupert Lowe set forward were accepted, from being in the cabinet. So Reform's actual MPs, its leadership team, who quietly and increasingly publicly agree with all the positions that Rupert Lowe put forward, are in favour of some kind of cooperation. Even Richard Tice said on Mike Graham's show that he refused to rule out working with Rupert Lowe in some capacity, and the details of such a deal would be left to being worked out. Sarah Pochin said something weird. She said that Restore are a party far to the right of Reform, and there are people in Restore that they wouldn't want in Reform, so she's not sure if a deal could be made, but of course we want to work with people. Given Sarah Pochin just said import the third world, get the third world, and she's sick to death of seeing diversity in adverts, I don't actually think there's a bit of daylight between Sarah Pochin and Restore Britain. Maybe she's talking about Steve Laws because she's believed the hit pieces in the Daily Mail against the party. Nevertheless, I think that's just unnecessary, and it's actually strategically unsound for Reform to say that certain things are far right, because then it means you can't occupy that ground when you actually want to occupy that ground. For example, saying mass deportations are a dark and dangerous and grave use of rhetoric that Rupert Lowe deployed, as Nigel Farage wrote in The Telegraph in March 2025, and then went on to endorse mass deportations a couple of months later. So you get egg on your face. Just don't use the phrase far right, guys, because you are considered the far right party by all of your opponents, and so you're just sharpening the stick with which they can beat you. The afternoon after Rupert Lowe put the video out, Nigel Farage put out quite a vague statement. And people were criticising him, saying, well, this meant nothing. But again, hear the signal through the noise. The fact that Nigel Farage did not rule out working with Rupert Lowe immediately, despite the two men despising each other on a personal level, was significant, because he says, the next election will be an existential fight to save the country we love, a mission I have now been fighting for 30 years. After 2 national election victories in as many years, many people now recognise that it will be a binary choice between Reform UK and Labour. With the prospect of an early general election increasingly likely, it's natural that people from across the political spectrum are considering which side of that fight they intend to be on. Patriotic voters believe in many of the same things, but only one party truly has the possibility of delivering change. To deliver that change, I understand reform will need the support of many people from other parties, as well as millions who have never voted before. That is the broad coalition I'm building. Over the last 18 months, I've demonstrated that our movement will always be open to anyone who shares our commitment to restoring Britain's borders, rebuilding our economy, renewing our democracy, and putting the British people first. What isn't included in there is demographic security, which again he hasn't said in front of cameras he's committed to, despite him saying on Substack that he's concerned about it. And in 2021, he was the pioneer on talking about white Britons becoming a minority. So he just needs to go back to his old and current written position. Anyway, Farage wrote, "My previous history in politics has shown that I am prepared to put country before party as I did in 2019, when he stood down against the Conservatives. But I will never turn my back on my team, and that means he's drawing a red line against expelling Jenrick and Suella. However, that doesn't stop him from not promoting Nadim Zahawi, Nadine Dorries, and the other Tory defectors, which, again, could be conditions which Rupert Lowe would agree with. There will always be a home in Reform UK for those who believe that the last 14 years of Conservative government followed by the last 2 years of Labour have failed the British people, and that our country now needs a fundamentally different direction. I will continue to do whatever is necessary to defeat the left and provide Britain with the strong, serious leadership it deserves. This is the last chance for our country, and we cannot afford to waste it." And then, at the press conference, he said explicitly he is open to a deal with Rupert Lowe.
On the Rupert Lowe stuff, well, my understanding is that he had a bit of a fallout last week with the Conservatives, who, you know, he had been working quite closely with for some time. You know, he said that he had a deal with the Conservatives, and Kemi Badenoch said they had an arrangement. I don't know what that was. My understanding is there was a bit of a fallout. Now, look, I mean, if you want to do a political deal with somebody, you know, you would contact them privately and not do a 12-minute video. That said, I did actually reach out back yesterday to him. I did say, look, should we have a call? I haven't heard back yet, so I don't know what the sincerity of this is. But it seemed to me that he was sort of, more than anything, perhaps putting out this gesture, saying, look, I'm the good guy, Nigel's the bad guy. Well, that's not the case. If you look at my history, you know, in politics over the last few years, I am prepared to do things and make sacrifices if I believe it's in the national interest. I certainly did that in 2019, and I would do whatever I could for us to have a sane centre-right alliance that beat Labour at the next general election. But I don't ditch my friends, I don't ditch my allies, whether that's Suella Braverman or Posh George, you know, I do not ditch people because somebody else wants me to. And there's an irony in this, which is that 2 years ago, Rupert Lowe said what a fantastic job Jenrick, Braverman and Kruger were doing inside the Conservative Party. And, you know, unlike Chris Philp, who failed completely, but now wants us all to forget it, in the case of Braverman and Jenrick, they resigned from their positions in their frustration that the government wouldn't get a grip. So that would not be a part of a negotiation. In broader terms, look, you know, you could see a situation where Restore, without the hope of winning anything outside Great Yarmouth, I mean literally without a hope of winning a single seat in the country, could do us great harm. And I think online you will see a lot of Restore potential voters now beginning to worry about the impact that might have. So look, I'll finalise that by saying if it was the offer of a deal, it came in a very unusual way. I have responded to it potentially, you know, with an open mind, as I would, but I'm certainly not going to be ditching people that I view to be allies and a great asset. Thank you.
Now, were the comments about Rupert Lowe not responding to Nigel Farage's request that they talk necessary? No. Were the repeated falsehoods about a deal with the Conservatives necessary? No. I mean, a lot of that is based on sort of schizoid conspiracy theory. that came about after Rupert Lowe's interview with J.K. Rees-Mogg, when he said he had an agreement not to badmouth the Conservatives. One, that was because they appointed him to the Public Accounts Committee, and he was told that he had to be polite to Chairman Sir Geoffrey Clifton Brown in order to stay on the Accounts Committee, despite the Tories' complicity in the ruin of the country that the Accounts Committee is currently accounting for. And also, he said it's J.K. Rees-Mogg because he was slipping by the agreement that he wasn't going to badmouth the Tories to arch-Tory defender J.K. Rees-Mogg, who's just applied to be a candidate in the next election, because he was saying, well, I won't call them a bunch of traitors, which means that he's calling them traitors by saying I won't call them traitors. Anyway, there is no secret pact with reform, and it's tiresome to keep refuting this. So Farage didn't need to do that. But Rupert Lowe also didn't need to take the bait and start insulting him on Dan Wood's show. So, gentlemen, can you please, for the love of God, just put your personal animosity aside and work together on something? And also, Farage did mischaracterize the way that communications channels were opened with Rupert Lowe, because, as Rupert posted here, Farage sent him a text after he posted the speech online saying we'll call later, which means Farage was setting the terms, the means, and the time by which they would communicate, and he hasn't called him, at least at the time that Farage had said, Rupert Lowe hasn't responded to me. But also it wasn't helpful that Rupert and his team posted on X that Farage was lying. And it also wasn't helpful that Montgomery Toms went on Times Radio and said it's the bare minimum for any agreement with Rupert Lowe and Nigel Farage to expel Suella Braverman and Robert Jenrick from cabinet positions. Like, it's not useful for the respective surrogates of each parties to try and speak for red lines on behalf of the leadership who are negotiating any kind of deal. It just makes it harder for them to talk to each other. So how about we lay off the insults if you actually want to see this deal done? And so Nigel Farage responded to Rupert Lowe's insults on Times Radio, saying, to his credit, that he wasn't going to engage in a tit for tat.
You know, I'm not quite sure what the offer was, to be honest with you, whether it was sincere or not. But I did say yesterday, you know, I'll call you later. I expected to get an okay or 4 o'clock suits. Didn't get anything. Let's see where it goes. So look, I'm not closing the door on it, but I'm just sort of slightly questioning what the deal is. Because it seems that,
well, he's already accused you of lying today, hasn't he?
Which is extraordinary. Is absolutely an extraordinary thing to have done. I'm not going to return the compliment, other than to say, you know, he's not a very easy person to deal with. But if there is a chat to be had, I will have that chat.
Okay, so you doubt his integrity?
Well, look, you're trying to drag that out of me. You know, he's insulted me today. I'm not going to return the compliment.
He wasn't closing the door on a deal, but he's now just confused as to what the terms of the deal are, because Rupert Lowe seems to have said he's not actually over the reason the deal couldn't be made in the first place. And so I end this on a sort of frustrated and pessimistic note. It's not impossible that the deal could be made, because people behind the scenes still want the men to work together. And if you did, it would be nothing but beneficial for the British right. Reform would get a series of credible, energised, popular personnel from Restore Britain. They'd regain credibility on a series of issues that Rupert Lowe has gained credibility on, for example, the grooming gangs and deportations. They could incorporate the elements of Restore policy that they liked. They could outsource their position on the death penalty to a referendum, as Rupert Lowe suggests. And they would gain popular support on those issues, not just with their own base, but a series of voters who don't think that they're credible yet. They could do what Trump did in 2024, gather their old enemies under the Allied banner, gain more voters, gain more credibility, and present a unified front against the uniparty. And they could even snap up a position on the Public Accounts Committee if they were so inclined. They would steal that away from the Tories if they were really worried about a Tory Restore pact. They would effectively shut the door on a Tory reform coalition and make it much harder for the saboteurs and traitors within their midst to oust Nigel Farage and replace him with a Tory. All of these things would be beneficial to reform. The deal is there for the taking. You just got to set your egos aside, put your personal dislike of one another to the back burner, work together to improve the country. And I don't care who fixes the problem, I just care that it is fixed. And I know there are good people on both sides, I have friends in the leadership. Just get in a room and figure this thing out.